Dawn rose like a shy confession over the Hayes cattle spread, its pale gold light leaking across the plains as if the sky itself were afraid to wake the world too quickly. In the kitchen, Juniper Malloy stood alone, flour dusting her fingers like winter frost. The morning stove hummed softly, the only heartbeat she could rely on. She mixed dough with slow practiced motions, but there was an unsteadiness in her wrist today, an ache she could not name. Outside the window, Calder Hayes' voice carried across the yard, low and rough as gravel dragged under a wagon wheel. June paused, her breath caught between ribs. She hadn't meant to listen, but his words slid through the glass all the same. "She's become too much trouble for this ranch," Calder muttered to one of the hands. The sentence slipped into her chest like a splinter. She stood there, still as a shadow, dough clinging to her palms. Trouble. The word struck her with a quiet, bruising force. She had spent her life trying to be small, helpful, invisible. Yet trouble still found her like a curse. She finished kneading the dough in silence, her throat tight. Calder stepped into the kitchen moments later, removing his hat with the rigid politeness of a man trying to keep his emotions pinned beneath bone and muscle. He didn't look at her at first, not fully, just long enough to see her hands trembling near the flour bowl. His jaw tightened. "June," he said, voice rough, "pack your belongings and leave by morning." The room seemed to fall out from under her. She stared at him, lips parted, but no sound emerged. There was no anger in her eyes, just a quiet devastation, like a lantern blown out in a single breath. She nodded once, gently, as if accepting a final truth. "I'll be gone by dawn," she whispered. And that was that. Calder turned away too quickly, as though looking at her would make him falter, as though he already regretted what he'd said. June walked out into the brightening day, the coldness inside her spreading like early frost. When she rode into town for supplies, dust rose around her boots like a warning. Etta Crowell stood behind the counter at her mercantile, eyes sharp, mouth twisted in a knowing smile. "Heard things ain't steady up at the Hayes Ranch," Etta chirped, leaning close enough to smell like peppermint and judgment. "Some folks say you've been keeping the hands a little too warm." June didn't answer. Her silence was a shield she'd polished over years of wandering. Outside, whispers braided around her like thorny vines. Poor thing. Always knew she wouldn't last. Women with no past always got something to hide. Sheriff Amos Ridge stepped out from his office, tipping his hat in quiet apology. "Folks talk when they're bored, Miss Malloy. Pay 'em no mind." But she already had. Every word stuck to her, heavy as wet wool. By the time she returned to the ranch, her heart felt worn thin. She cooked dinner like a ghost drifting between stoves and tables. Calder watched her from the doorway, arms crossed tightly, eyes flickering with something close to regret, but he kept his distance. He had learned long ago that closeness was dangerous, that needing someone could hollow a man out when they left. But watching her move through the kitchen now, hands trembling, breath shallow, made something in him twist painfully. Tommy Flynn, a sweet-hearted ranch hand barely in his 20s, leaned close to whisper, "Beans are salter tonight. Think the cook's heart's been leaking into the pot." June laughed softly, a sound more fragile than glass. She tore her last loaf of bread in half and handed it to him. "For the road," she said gently. "You always work better on a full stomach." Calder's chest tightened. She was leaving, yet still giving pieces of herself away with quiet generosity. Nights settled heavy as iron. June walked to her small room, the walls breathing memories she tried not to gather. She packed slowly, folding her few possessions. A faded ribbon that had belonged to her mother, a wooden spoon from her first home, a worn Bible with water-stained pages. Each item told a story of leaving, of surviving, of traveling from ranch to boarding house to frontier town, searching for a place where she might finally rest. She sat on the edge of her cot, hands gripping the ribbon until her knuckles whitened. The ranch had been the closest thing she'd felt to home in years. Calder's footsteps in the morning, his quiet nods over coffee, the safety of knowing someone strong moved through the hallways. It had all slipped under her ribs without warning. But she was packing. Again. Because even the gentlest dream wasn't meant for someone like her. Outside, wind hissed across the grasslands. A storm was rolling in, dark, thick, restless. Calder stood in the barn, staring at the saddle he'd been pretending to adjust. Rain clouds pressed low overhead. He saw June's small travel bag resting by the door, and something inside him broke open. He'd pushed her away not because she'd done wrong, but because she'd done too much right. Because her presence had softened the hard edges of his loneliness. Because she'd made him feel alive again. And that terrified him. He stepped outside as thunder growled across the horizon. Lightning snapped like a whip over the distant hills. Then he saw her. June was out by the corral, fighting the rising wind as she tried to secure feed sacks the storm threatened to scatter. Even now, on her last night, she was thinking of the ranch, not herself. "June," Calder shouted. "Get inside." She didn't hear him over the roar of the wind. Or maybe she did and ignored it. That was just like her, quiet resilience stitched into every motion. A loose beam swung in the gale like a pendulum of fate. Calder's heart dropped. "June." She turned just as the beam snapped free, hurtling toward her. Calder lunged across the mud, tackling her to the ground just as it slammed into the earth where she'd been standing. They landed hard, his arms wrapped around her, breath mingling with hers. Rain drizzled down in cold, stinging drops. For a heartbeat, the world slowed. Their chests rose in the same rhythm. Her eyelashes fluttered. His hand trembled against her shoulder. She whispered, voice barely a breath, "Why does it matter now?" "I'm leaving." He froze. Inside the barn, dripping wet, they stood staring at each other while thunder rolled overhead like a troubled confession. Calder turned away at first, fists clenched so tight his knuckles paled. "June," he said, voice cracking. "I never meant for you to hear those words earlier. I never meant half the things I say when fear's got its hands on my throat." She swallowed, blinking back tears. "Fear of what? I've never asked anything of you." "That's the worst part," he whispered. "You never asked, and somehow that made me want to give." For the first time, June let her heart speak with trembling honesty. She told him she stayed because the ranch felt like the first place where dawn didn't hurt, where someone's footsteps, his, made her feel less alone. She cooked for him not out of duty, but out of affection she never dared confess. "I'm leaving because I respect your word," she whispered, voice cracking. "Not because I want to." Lightning flashed across the barn, illuminating her wet hair, her shaking hands, her brave eyes full of heartbreak. Calder stepped toward her slowly, as if approaching a wild creature he'd accidentally wounded. "June," he murmured, "I pushed you away because you made me feel again. Because you're the one warm thing in a life I thought would stay cold." His breath trembled. "I was scared I'd need you more than you'd need me." The barn door slammed in the wind, a thunderous punctuation. Calder reached for her bag, lifting it gently. Then he placed it on the floor between them and nudged it away from the door. "You're not leaving," he said softly. "Not unless that's what you truly want." His voice dropped to a raw whisper. "You belong here with us. With me." June's breath quivered. She didn't answer with a speech, only a trembling nod, the smallest, bravest gesture she had ever made. Outside, the storm eased as though the sky itself finally exhaled. As the wind softened and rain turned to mist, it felt like the world gave them permission to begin again. And here's where the old soul inside the story turns toward you, reader of quiet truths and gentle aches. Life has a way of testing us not with gunfights or thunderous confrontations, but with small moments where we must choose between running and staying. Pride often fences itself against longing, and fear hides inside certainty, whispering that it's safer to be alone. But storms blow open doors we pretend are locked. They reveal the people who steady our hands, who soften our burdens, who make the hard ground feel almost like home. Hold close the ones who offer small kindnesses, the ones who listen more than they speak, the ones who steady the wind inside you without ever announcing they've done so. Because love, real love, doesn't arrive with fireworks or grand declarations. It comes quietly, like June Malloy standing in a lantern-lit barn, her heart trembling but open. Slow as dawn, soft as bread shared with a friend, steady as a cowboy finally admitting he can't bear to watch her walk away.